It's going live. It's live. Everyone's laughing on the Zoom. I don't know what's going on. Anyways, I think we're good. So hello, everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me. If you can't hear me, message me. I don't know. But everything should be working pretty well. We're very happy that you all decided to come out today. That's going to be a good round. And we just thought it would be important for us to get a good idea of what's going on in the March topic. We know there's a lot of different state tournaments. There's NSTA qualifiers, lots of regional action going on. And a common theme throughout all of that is everyone needs to learn kind of how to debate in front of diverse audiences, how to debate more traditionally, because the way you debate, in the out rounds of a national tournament might not be the same as the way you need to debate on the local level to find similar success. So with that said, I'll introduce myself and then I guess everyone can go around. So I'm Sandeep. I am from Massachusetts. I debated at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School for a bunch of years. And obviously working at PFA this summer, pretty excited for it. And I am also a student at Georgetown University. So if anyone has any questions about Georgetown too, feel free to hit me up after the round or whenever, and it'll be a good time. So I guess we'll move on to Nathan.
Yeah, I'm Nathan, and I debate for Campbell Hall. I've been debating for about 2 years on the national circuit. And I do not know where I'm going to college yet, unlike Sandeep.
Hi, I'm Zara. I debate for Dalton in New York, and this is my 6th year debating, but 4th year in PF.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I'm from Medina, Minnesota, and this is my 5th year debating.
Hello, my name is Sanjita, and I debate for Doherty Valley in California. Have been for 3 years, and I also do not know where I'm going to college yet.
I'm Francesca. I also debated for Campbell Hall for 4 years, and I'm currently at the University of Chicago. So exciting round today between the pro team of Nathan and Zara against Arjun and Sanjita on the con. And the resolution is the March one, which is, for people that don't know, it's resolved on balance. The benefits of creating the United States Space Force outweigh the harms. So we should see a really great round. Ask a lot of questions, and it should be a fun time.
Yeah, so before we dive right into it, there's a couple things we need to make clear. Number one, if you're interested in the prep giveaway and the free office hours, that will be linked in the description at some time during the round. I'm not sure when, maybe like when someone needs extra prep time, who knows, but I'll get it in there. And also, for everyone who doesn't know, this is a lay round. So I'm sure, you can find a lot of videos on YouTube of debaters and also like these debaters, like giving it their all in flow rounds, debating quickly, debating technically. But we know that March is kind of a unique month. So everyone kind of needs to adapt a little more on the regional level. So this is a lay round. So it's hopefully also a tutorial that can be used on any topic, right? Even if you're not debating Space Force, it'll still be helpful for you to kind of digest some of the things me and Francesca will talk about, and also see what techniques the debaters use. The last thing I'll say is in terms of the chat, obviously we want to keep the chat, in control. As you know from camp, no horsing around. So keep it civil in the chat. If not, there's a lot of PFA staff members hanging around in the live chat as moderators. So, you might get your comment deleted. You might get a little timeout, but we trust you. Keep letting the chat, just let it go, have a good time, but, make sure that you're not, being disrespectful in any way, and everything will be all right. So with that said, I think we're ready to rumble, and I'll pass it off to Zara for the first pro constructive.
Yeah, can everyone hear on the Zoom? And then I assume they'll be able to hear on the live stream. Okay, great. Nathan and I affirm resolved. On balance, the benefits of creating the United States Space Force outweigh the harms. Our first contention is protecting satellites. The Union of Concerned Scientists reported last year that there are nearly 3,000 satellites in orbit, responsible for everything from highly secure military communications to civilian internet access. Unfortunately, prior to the creation of the Space Force, America's satellites, the key to both economic and military success, were alarmingly vulnerable. In fact, Chapple of Space News reported in 2018 that the technology developed by China and Russia could ultimately prove more effective in degrading US military forces than a nuclear threat. Fortunately, establishing the Space Force will defend our satellites in two ways. The first is improved cybersecurity. Historically, Pillai writes that 2 US satellites were compromised in 2007 and 2008 through a ground station. The attack, carried out via the internet, was traced to China. Fortunately, Barnett21 explains the Space Force protects satellites and other space-based assets from hacking, with cyber personnel being the one category of employee the agency is actively bringing aboard. Second, the creation of the Space Force has allowed us to use more satellites. In 2012, when space militarization was still burdened with layers of bureaucracy under the Air Force, the Christian Science Monitor reported that US satellites were left in rapid decline with few plans to replace them. Fortunately, in addition to maintaining satellites, Barbier20 explains that the Space Force is increasing the number of satellites in orbit by decreasing their size so they are cheaper and easier to deploy. Indeed, recent years have seen a proliferation of small satellites in orbit, a technology the Space Force is actively pursuing. For these reasons, Wasserman 20 reports that the number of satellites orbiting Earth is projected to quintuple over the next decade. Barbier continues that by fostering an explosion in the number of usable satellites, the loss of one or even several would no longer represent an existential threat to their operation. The impact is preserving global stability. Barbier confirms that improved satellite technology contributed to the decisive coalition victory in the Gulf War by providing instantaneous surveillance of the enemy forces, as well as enabling precision missile and airstrikes. The NSI furthered that an attack on satellites could cause financial damage and uncertainty comparable to that of a nuclear war. Our second contention is deterring our adversaries. Prior to the Space Force, the United States, burdened by a disorganized, inefficient program, fell behind its adversaries in the space race. Harrison 18 reports that the authority and responsibility for space was fragmented, with more than 60 different organizations responsible for new acquisitions, slowing decision-making and disunifying efforts in building new capabilities. As such, despite an on-paper increase in spending, actual investment was never effectively allocated. Indeed, Stockton 18 confirms that the Air Force's space power investments have not increased since 2013, while its overall spending climbed 30%. Thus, Stockton concludes that the US military is 6 to 8 years behind its geopolitical flows in deploying new space technology. Fortunately, the Space Force reversed this trend. Indeed, the Berkeley Political Review 20 writes that the Space Force consolidates space-related military into a singular branch. As a result, US development of new technologies has never been greater. Indeed, Ayers reports that the Space Force began its first year by pursuing new heights of innovation and cutting-edge solutions to accelerate systems modernization and procure next-generation technologies. As a result, Chang 20 confirms that the United States has assumed a technological lead in space over its adversaries. The impact of maintaining a technological lead in space is preventing conflict. Unfortunately, China is using its capabilities to deter the US from intervening in Chinese-initiated conflicts. For example, Chapple of Strategic Studies Quarterly warned in 2017 that China uses its new space technologies to tailgate vulnerable US satellites as a way to check on any response to power grabs in areas like Taiwan and the South China Sea. As such, Chang 20 predicts that China's space leverage could enhance their lethality across a range of scenarios and allow them to project power in the South China Sea. Unfortunately, even a singular conflict is devastating, as one of Texas A&M in 2017 finds the livelihoods of millions of people and the economies of many countries are at stake in the South China Sea dispute. For both of these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
All right, let's discuss this case. So for any thoughts, any major thoughts?
I think the first thing that comes to mind in front of a lay round is like, what is the strategic advantage of having a one contention case compared to a two contention case? So obviously this one has, the first contention has multiple subpoints and it's two contentions. So there's multiple avenues that Zara and Nathan can go down, but it might be interesting if Arjun and Sanjita read a case that's more of a narrative type case, and how that will kind of interact with it, because this one definitely could lead to some sort of confusion in front of some lay judges where there's like a lot of ideas going on.
Yeah, and I think one thing you want to focus on this topic is this topic is a little difficult in terms of lay audiences, just because there's going to be a lot of arguments about militarization. And so the question always is, how can you make good arguments in front of lay judges and parent judges who, obviously have a predisposition to not really thinking that these conflict arguments are likely. So I think a big thing that this case does well is it really clearly lays out why these conflicts are taking place. So on the first argument, it's kind of like our satellites can help guide us when we do military conflicts. And on the second argument, it's if China's able to, get an edge over our satellites, they can do whatever they want, in their near abroad, I guess. So I think the big thing to note here and throughout this round is this topic is hard for lay judges. So the question is, how can you frame your cases and your ideas over the course of the round in a way that's simple and easy to understand? I think Arjun's ready.
Sounds good. Sanjita and I negate. Our thesis and sole contention is that the Space Force is a failed political pawn that is undermining international cooperation. Before the creation of the US Space Force, Earth's final frontier was mainly a space of peaceful cooperation and scientific exploration. However, by signaling that America was willing to use more offensive operations in space, COB 18 finds that establishing the Space Force created a point of no return in the militarization of space. The rise of the US Space Force upset this peaceful balance in two ways. First is through a security dilemma. Strout 20 finds that this offensive shift suggests that the US is planning for conflict, eroding Russia and China's trust. Indeed, Capaccio 20 writes that in coming years, the Space Force will build 48 weapons to jam Russian and Chinese satellites. COB 18 specifies that at the pace at which the Space Force is militarizing right now is far too fast, which is why Silva 19 concludes that this inspires countries around the world to develop space weaponry, increasing the likelihood of conflict and pushing us into an arms race that no country is prepared for. This is empirically backed, as President Putin has said that Russia needed to develop its space forces further in response to the US's rapid development, and the US Space Command 20 finds that Russia clearly has no intention of halting their space weapons programs given their new developments of space weapons to counter the US. China has also stepped up its responses. The AFT 19 reports that China views the US Space Force as a direct threat to its security, which is why Broad 21 finds that China has stepped up its space militarization significantly to now have unprecedented abilities to attack American satellites. This arms race would have disastrous implications, as Miller 20 outlines two ways that Russia and China would respond. First, they deploy additional intercontinental missiles with countermeasures designed to defeat satellite interceptors. And second, to increase the chances of survival against US defenses, they would increase the number of warheads on each missile, making them more threatening. The US would ultimately be up against a substantially larger and more diverse arsenal. Second is through overhyping threats. Our government and private companies have a history of prioritizing profits over people, and the creation of the Space Force is no exception. Grego 20 explains that resources and funding for the Space Force will incentivize the national security bureaucracy to hype up the threat of space weapons and to build new weapons. Indeed, Billings 18 describes that companies began capitalizing on the profit and power, boosting the prospect of the Space Force as soon as President Trump began classifying space as a warfighting domain. Already, Irwin 20 documents that Lockheed Martin has been given a $5 billion contract by the Space Force, and companies like Northrop Grumman and Harris Corporation will also have their pockets lined for years to come. Thompson 18 warns that this dependence on industry is extremely dangerous because relying on companies for policy advice will distort the objectives of the Space Force. Indeed, Pugue 15 finds that defense contractors use money to lobby for aggressive war policy because it benefits their business prospects, which will push America into space conflict. The impact is conflict. Grego 20 explains that the rate at which the US is diplomatically engaging with its adversaries is not nearly enough, and thus we risk misinterpreting each other in very serious ways in space. Given the nascency of the space domain, there is no track record to interpret decisions from the adversary, making the chance for miscalculation incredibly high. Broder 16 finds that if a conflict were to erupt in space, civilian and military satellites would go down, catalyzing a frenzy on Earth that would easily spiral into a full-scale three-way war between the US, Russia, and China. A RAND Corporation analysis in 2016 found that such a war would start small but quickly spiral out of control, causing up to 35% Chinese GDP loss. And Fisher 15 ultimately concludes that it would result in economies crumbling, food chains collapsing, millions dying in bitter battle, and ultimately World War III. But even in the absence of full-scale war, loss of cooperation risks hurting space exploration crucial for innovation and our economy. Schwartz 18 writes that the creation of the Space Force and the weaponization of space has eroded US-Russia space cooperation and will completely phase out the International Space Station. However, the OECD explains that these space discoveries from the International Space Station since 1998 have had spillover effects to the rest of the economy, such as agriculture and healthcare, generating $1.4 trillion of social economic benefits. These innovations saved lives. For example, Miller 15 writes that ISS created purification systems control microbial growth around the world, and this is crucial because 1 billion people lack access to clean drinking water and 3.5 million people die annually. Thus, we negate.
Awesome. Yeah. So this case was pretty clear in terms of it's also in it's a one contention case, like Franny was discussing. So the question that you all should be asking yourself is like, which argument and which case do you think is better matching up for the second half of the round? You know, if you were a lay judge, if you were a judge that wasn't taking down significant notes, which case argument or which case would you think generally is the way to go? Which one is more convincing to you? So I think in general, the idea behind a one contention case is kind of setting up the judge and setting up the audience for a clear narrative throughout the round, right? So you know that the con team is going to really talk about this whole idea of retaliation and counter aggression, whereas the AF, you know, you don't necessarily know if Nathan might focus his first rebuttal on, you know, one of his case arguments when cross-applying, or Zara in summary is going to really go in on satellites or deterrence. But you know the con argument is going in one very specific direction. So that can be seen as an advantage of a one contention case. You give up some breadth, but you get some depth, which is often more important in lay rounds.
Yeah, also kind of going off of that, I think once both cases are read, going into crossfire especially, some techniques that you want to think about are like, what are the main kind of similarities between the two cases and what are some ways that I can poke out holes? So Sandeep kind of got to this, but on the con case, like the main central idea is that it increases aggression, right, from our adversaries. But then on the pro side, a lot of it is about like creating some sort of defensive mechanisms and having some sort of deterrence, right? So in terms of how does this cause China to react? How does this cause North Korea to react? Other countries as well? I think it's going to be important. One thing also going into crossfire that the con team might want to do is basically focus on one of the main arguments so they can get one contention basically out of the way before going into it and having to focus on both contentions during second rebuttal, which I think can be really helpful, especially in front of a lay judge, when you get one contention kind of out of the way so you have a lot less to deal with for Sanjita in her second rebuttal.
So now we'll go into crossfire and we'll see what happens.
Okay, Arjun, are you good?
Yep.
Okay, great. Is the International Space Station operated under the Space Force or under NASA?
It's operated under NASA, but the Space Force is crucial to maintaining the relations that NASA has with other countries in the International Space Station. So our argument isn't contingent on the Space Force.
Do you mind if I ask a quick follow-up to that question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so why is it necessary that the research conducted on the ISS is done so with other countries? I mean, surely you would get the same results if an American astronaut and a Russian astronaut conducted the same experiments.
So the Miller 15 evidence talks about how the ISS needs like Russian, Chinese, other countries' technologies in addition to the US in order to create these purification systems. And there's other sorts of systems such as like, there's some other stuff with like hunger and stuff that they can only specifically test in space. And they've used the research for all the countries. So to answer your question, it needs all of them.
I would say that that doesn't really answer my question though, because you talked about how it has collaborated with other countries in the past. I'm asking why it's necessary that we collaborate with other countries. We may have gotten technology,
because
but is it needed?
Yeah, it's needed because like we just would not have been able to. Well, that Miller evidence says explicitly that like without collaboration from the other countries, we wouldn't have been able to create it. So like even like I don't have anything saying that like
that might have been the case, but NASA operates the ISS right now, but we've been on this for a while, so you can take a question.
Okay, on your contention one, what is the incentive for China or Russia to cyber attack the US and like cause some sort of immense damage if there isn't a Space Force?
Same as the incentive is with the Space Force. They want to maintain control of global satellite networks, and the best way to do that is by taking out their largest opponent.
But why would they do that if they're not provoked?
Because the fact that the US currently, or at one point, had more satellites than everyone else, more successful satellites than everyone else, is in and of
Right.
itself a threat to either of these countries dominating that area.
But like the US just putting up civilian satellites for like telecommunications and GPS tracking and stuff like that, why does that threaten them?
It's the same type of like space technology that China and Russia both want to be leaders on.
Right, but the only difference between your world and our world, or rather a world with and without the Space Force, is that before the Space Force, it was all mainly civilian technologies, whereas the Space Force was uniquely militarized.
This is absolutely not the case. They were still spending billions of dollars on space militarization prior to the creation of the Space Force. In fact,
Yes,
for
they
the
were.
Arjun, if I could finish, as
Yeah,
for the evidence that we explained clearly in our case, the biggest change is, first of all, they're hiring more people for cybersecurity. Second of all, it's more centralized so that we can be more efficient with the resources we are allocated.
Right, but there was also, you're right that they still were spending a lot on military in space, but all of that was defensive posturing. It was preventing us from being militarily attacked. So yes, it was classified under military spending, but it wasn't offensive.
Crosses over.
Yeah.
So I think some clear takeaways from that cross, especially if I'm a lay judge, is like starting just getting off the bat. Zara asked like a really great question, I thought, a very targeted question that really got like kind of Arjun in a hole at one point. That was just kind of like, why do you need other countries for cooperation, right? In terms of increasing exploration or increasing innovation and other sorts. So this kind of sets up before Nathan even has to give his response and rebuttal, which I assume he's probably going to do. Just some kind of clear grounds of what you can go off of. So I think those type of questions that really puts them in a hole and making sure that you keep on pressing them on it can be helpful, especially in terms of lay judges, because you want them to hear your response as many times as possible and just grab onto something that they can understand. So Nathan doesn't have to explain it as much in his rebuttal speech as well.
I think another thing that's important is like what happens now, right? So we had this crossfire, and obviously Zara asked some strategic questions on the whole idea of cooperation. So I think that what everyone should think about when they're going into these rounds, especially in front of lay judges, if you find that your argument, might be getting weaker after crossfire, or there are a lot of questions that your opponents pose to that argument during crossfire, it might be strategic for you to kind of switch it up and really focus on a different argument for the rest of the round, right? So what you might want to do if you're the con in this scenario is you might want to not really focus on cooperation because there's already, seeds of doubt in the judge's head, right? Obviously, if you can defend it and you can deflect away those answers very effectively in the second rebuttal, then you can do that. But the key, right, is just to make sure that you're staying ahead of the game. And that's what you need to like analyze your crossfire, right? So maybe even Nathan in this next speech, right? Like there's already some work done on cooperation. I don't think Nathan necessarily has to spend a ton of time really just digging into cooperation. He should probably allocate his time in other parts of the round, right? So think about how crossfire shapes the rest of your round and your rebuttal strategy, because I don't think a lot of debaters actually think about, what happened in cross, what's perceptually happening on my case. And if you do think about those ideas, then you'll have a much better strategy of how to move forward in the round instead of just not listening and kind of just doing the same thing over again. So that said, Nathan, ready to go?
Yeah. All right, is everyone ready? Awesome. Let's go down my opponent's case. Firstly, where they said that space was peaceful prior to the creation of the Space Force. This is simply untrue, and they have no evidence suggesting this. What Cheng in 2020 writes is that China and Russia created their own Space Force in 2015, which is why our evidence says that the US was 6 to 8 years behind its space adversaries prior to the Space Force. So the chance of conflict and miscalculation always exists in either world. This means that this debate is not a question of whether space militarization is good or not. It is instead a question of whether the US should sit back and do nothing, or if we should keep doing something and keep up with our adversaries. With that in mind, let's go to the specifics of their case where they discuss the security dilemma in their first argument. They say the Space Force could push Russia to withdraw from a treaty, but this does not say that the Space Force will cause Russia to withdraw from the treaty. Instead, it says that if the US withdrew first, then Russia would. They're not proving that this happens if you affirm. They say that Putin and China are saying that they need to develop their own space capabilities in response to the US. This is just political rhetoric to garner more public support for their space programs. My opponents themselves say in their second argument that even the US is doing this by overhyping threats in the Space Force. In reality, Russia and China will militarize regardless of the US Space Force because they view it as strategically competitive. They then say that Russia and China are going to create more ICBMs and more warheads. This evidence says that China and Russia would deploy these weapons on Earth, not in space, which means they don't link into their impact, but conflict in space because it's not in space. So even if they win this argument, you cannot vote off it. Let's go to their second argument where they discuss the military-industrial complex and overhyping of threats. They first say that dependence on the military-industrial complex is heavy in the Space Force. No, the Space Force is not entirely dependent on the military-industrial complex for things like technical expertise. For example, Sheets in last year writes that the US also heavily relies on private companies like SpaceX, which are commercial companies, not violent companies. They then say that weapons companies are going to lobby for more aggressive war policies. A few problems here. First of all, this does not apply to the Space Force specifically. Before the Space Force, companies lobbied because the government would only buy bombs during a war because you can't use a bomb outside of wartime. But with the Space Force, these companies can make deals without war like they are right now. So there's no incentive to actually lobby in the first place. For example, I don't need to be in a war to actually have significant uses of a satellite, for example. But also, secondly, this argument does not link into their impact about conflict because that's dependent on miscalculation caused by more countries having more space weapons, but lobbying doesn't do that. Actual funding does, which they do regardless. On their impact about conflict, a few problems here. First of all, they never tell you how we, quote, risk misinterpreting each other in very serious ways or how large this risk is. Countries have been militarizing for decades in space and nothing bad has happened thus far. But secondly, this does not say that the risk of miscalculation is very high. It's just their own assertion. This is why our second contention on conflict always outweighs on probability, because you know for a fact that countries like China use the Space Force as a means to deter the US from intervening in conflicts like Taiwan, like Vietnam, things that have happened historically in the past. You don't know if miscalculation actually happens. It's just a complete shot in the dark. Historically speaking, whenever these countries make new strides in weapon innovation, for example, nuclear weapons, miscalculation never occurs because all countries recognize that launching a first strike is too risky. They say that China's GDP will drop in the event of an attack, but this is actually a reason why war wouldn't happen because these countries are economically interdependent on one another and wouldn't want to destroy their own economies, which is why miscalculation has, again, never happened in the past. Let's go to their second impact, where they discuss space exploration. They first say that the ISS creates a bunch of disruptive technologies, but there's no explanation, as Zara was alluding to in first Crossfire, they don't really have an answer to this, as to why Russia and US cooperation is needed to create these disruptive technologies. For example, their evidence from Miller indicates that, quote, throughout NASA's history, not the ISS's, we've developed technologies that save and improve lives across the globe. Nowhere does it say that the ISS created these technologies. It's actually NASA that's been the one doing it. And also, we say that there's other things that are eroding cooperation in the status quo. For example, just a few years ago, after the Crimean crisis, we sanctioned Russian officials who were spearheading the Russian Space Force, which is why they are now decreasing cooperation in the status quo. Overall, the entire case is a shot in the dark. Vote for what you know and for what you can put your finger on, which is conflict in the South China Sea. Thank you.
So I think one thing that we see here going off of Nathan's rebuttal is in front of lay judges doing kind of like line by line comparisons versus just saying the response, right? So I think Nathan did a really great job starting off with the uniqueness and kind of going down the case on each individual subpoint. Especially, I think that he was really great with the line by line when it came to the impact scenario, right? So there's a lot of things that are being read here about nuclear war scenarios happen, but I think that Nathan really took out the impacts by kind of going over this probability of analysis by just saying that China's used it to deter in the past. There's no historical precedence. And then one thing I think that Nathan also did a really good job that we were talking about before was that Zara kind of set up this response in Crossfire that was just talking about how cooperation, like there's no reason why we need other states or other countries to basically be doing this cooperation. And Nathan kind of hit home on that in his rebuttal, which again makes it to a lay judge very apparent that this response is going to come up. It makes it extremely hard for Arjun and Sanjita to now come up and actually defend this argument and make this one that they have to go for. So it almost makes them go for their like other arguments in their case a lot more because of that.
Yeah, and I think there's always like a question on whether or not, you think you can go for conflict scenarios in front of lay judges, which is why I think the point about how the AF kind of hammered home on cooperation was very, very smart. Because if you think about it, right, like if you're running a nuclear war argument in your case, and then you also have this other you have your other contention about something that, is a more probable impact, then the lay judge will be inclined to buy your more probable impact right from the time you read the case. So I think it's really important to kind of think about when you're making these decisions in first rebuttal, where are you allocating your time? You can't just go down a case and just, give a 4-minute rebuttal and say, wherever the 4 minutes ends up, whatever. You need to think about, we need to put a lot of emphasis here. We need to put a little bit of emphasis there. So another thing that I would also like mention is just the idea of like line by line that Franny mentioned versus, numbering your responses 1, 2, 3, 4. So obviously there's benefits and harms to both approaches. But I think generally, like, you need to make sure that when you're doing line by line responses, it's very targeted towards specific claims your opponents make. So just don't go up there and say, they say other countries are militarizing. Here's a response. You should say, they specifically talk about Russia. Here's a response to Russia. So if you are going to take the approach that you want to be more line by line, be as specific as possible, because any judge, even traditional lay judges, they do like that extra level of comparison that you can give. All right, Sanjita, we ready?
Yep, I'm good. Okay. The thesis of our case is very simple. In a world with a space force, you destroy any sort of peaceful cooperation that happened in space prior to the creation. At the top of our case, he says something about how there was no peace before the space force and we were going to militarize regardless. Two problems with this. One, this completely ignores the Strout evidence, which tells you that uniquely because of the creation of the Space Force, there's a shift from defensive creation to offensive. This offensive shift is specifically what scares countries like Russia and China into developing more space weapons. And second, even if they were militarizing before, their case tells you that attacks from China, for example, were very small scale. Nothing actually happened as a result of them. The only world in which you trigger larger scale attacks is when you destroy this cooperation and scare China and Russia. Then they talk about how Putin is completely all political rhetoric and they're always going to develop weapons regardless. But this is our argument. We give Russia and China a scapegoat to develop more weapons. When we continue to develop weapons, we basically allow President Putin in Russia to be like, oh, the United States is developing a bunch of space weapons. Now we have to do it too. That's really, really bad because it links into our impact from Miller, which tells you that in response to space militarization, other countries will, one, increase the number of missiles that they're creating, and two, put more warheads on each missile, making miscalculation and conflict much more likely. They say our impact doesn't link in because it's deployment on Earth and not in space. But the Miller evidence says that this deployment on Earth is in response to space militarization, which is how we link into our impact about war. Then go to the bottom where he talks about how we don't really give any contextualization for why miscalculation would happen now, and we've been militarizing for decades. Two problems. One, remember, this shift from defense to offense only occurred uniquely because of the Space Force. And second, the Grego evidence is very good, and it says that space is very unique because there are no rules or precedents for attack, which means that miscalculation is much, much more likely in a space environment than it is in a ground environment. Then they talk about how economies are interdependent, so miscalculation will never occur. If anything, this is much more responsive to their case than ours, because our case is reliant on a response to an attack or a response to a miscalculation. That doesn't involve a first strike from a country, whereas their case relies on a first strike, which is why economic interdependence would matter much more on their case. If anything, they took out their own argument. But go on to their case. A couple problems. At the top, Farley finds that the creation of the Space Force really has no unique benefits. For example, like private sector companies like SpaceX can always throw up satellites, and Barrow finds that Trump resurrected Spacecom in 2019, which does the exact same stuff. But specifically on their link about satellites, all the satellites increasing that they talk about are because of a SpaceX project called Starlink. They created 12,000 new satellites intended to increase internet access. Their evidence doesn't even talk about the Space Force. But if anything, Russia and China would never even think about attacking us in the first place unless they feel threatened. That only happens in an affirmative world. But specifically on cybersecurity, the Space Force clearly isn't working because as of a month ago, the New York Times find that China has the ability to completely cut off all of our contact with satellites. The reason is because they're too bogged down with bureaucracy, which I'll get to on their second contention. Go to their second contention about adversaries. First, they try to perpetuate Trump's rhetoric about how we need to consolidate the military and we need one specific branch for space. But if anything, historical precedence proves that this is a really, really bad thing. One, because bureaucratic infighting means they're not going to get anything done for up to 15 years. Look to the Air Force. The Army and the Air Force spent 15 years duplicating and wasting resources, which is why we failed to launch a satellite before the Soviet Sputniks. It created unnecessary tensions and there was a lot of unproductivity. It doesn't matter if the US can make strong enough weapons to deter their adversaries in the future. If anything, our impacts will already trigger within the 15 years that they talk about. But on their impact specifically, their impact is about how China is going to first strike in the South China Sea, but there's a lot of alternative actors that are stopping them from doing this, which is why our miscalculation scenario is much more likely than any sort of first strike where a country intentionally attacks another one.
Okay, yeah. So I think the good thing about this speech, right, is you kind of know exactly where the con is going, right? So you know that they're no longer, going to talk about their cooperation argument, which is probably the smart thing to do, given that if a lay judge were to be viewing this round, they would definitely have a lot of different thoughts about cooperation after first cross and the first rebuttal. So they do make a good decision, I think, to go for the conflict. And they do, respond pretty effectively to all of the responses. So I think like something more general about where we are at the round is that we're at a point where it's kind of shaping up to be a debate between, deterrence and aggression. So the con's making the argument that, basically, there's a shift from defensive to offensive space weapons, and that's going to make countries more aggressive. Whereas Nathan pointed out in his rebuttal that, these countries are already militarizing. So at this point in the round, I think you can do this in lay rounds and flow rounds, any rounds. You should think about how you can simplify as best as possible. And I think the best way to simplify is through that approach. It's deterrence versus aggression. Which one works? Which one is more nice? But which one is more historically true?
Yeah, kind of going off of that, I think thinking about arguments that I have to go for now and for summary, it's kind of, I feel like the second contention about deterring adversaries was touched a lot less in the second rebuttal. And oftentimes that happens because of like time commitments that just happen in terms of frontlining your case and then going back to your case and kind of having to, going back to their case and I kind of have to do the first contention first. Kind of going off of this, I feel like Zara and Nathan have a lot of room to go for their second contention, considering kind of the only response to the impact scenario about the South China Sea was that there are alternative actors that could come into this scenario, but there aren't alternative actors in the cons argument. So I think really pointing out that you don't know what the alternative actors are, it's very unclear, it's very unspecific, and kind of that type of rhetoric in front of lay judges can be super helpful in terms of summary stuff. And then going off on the con side, kind of what Sandeep was talking about as well. I think Arjun and Sanjita have a lot of room to go for like pressing this thing about how we've created it more offensive in space and less defensive. And going off of that, I think there needs to be a little bit more work done about historical trends and what has happened when this has happened in the past. But I guess we'll see what happens in some of the summary speeches, but just being a little bit more specific.
I think generally also in terms of crossfire, so Franny's saying, we should go for the like second contention on the AF. And so if you're making that decision, you should make that decision before crossfire, right? So I think a mistake a lot of teams make is they kind of just wait, they do the crossfire, they talk about all sorts of things, and then they sit down and they say, all right, now what do we go for? But you should make that decision, because Franny can clearly see, it might be a better decision to go for that second argument. So you should make that decision before the crossfire. You don't need crossfire to tell you to make that decision. And then you can model your crossfire after that, right? So you can really try and frontline your second contention through crossfire and make it more of an emphatic argument in the judge's mind. But the big thing you do not want to happen in front of a lay judge is for second cross to be super, super messy. You don't want to be all over the place talking about all of these different arguments, especially in front of a more traditional judge. You have to start whittling down your argumentation and making sure that it's very clear, and it's also very pointed in a direction you want the debate to go in.
Also, just going off of some crossfire techniques, a lot of times second cross can be used for kind of fixing mistakes as well in the round, especially in front of lay judges. So maybe a good strategy that like Sanjita could have in the next crossfire is kind of going more over responses to the second contention as well, and kind of explaining more what you meant by adversaries. Also, kind of, but alternative like actors also being in that impact as well. I think would be something really good and to clear up a little bit more, especially in front of lay judges.
So we good? We good for cross?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. All right. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. So can I take the first question? All right. Let's talk about what you said at the top of your case. So you say that the Space Force initiated a shift from defensive to offensive creation, but then on our case, you said that the Space Force does nothing new. So which one is it?
Yeah, so the shift that I'm talking about specifically is not necessarily a shift in like actual operations. It's more that one, Trump's rhetoric when he created the Space Force established space as a warfighting domain, whereas previously, even if we were militaristically developing stuff, all of those developments were just, even if they were militaristic, they weren't offensive, like we weren't striking other countries' satellites for fun. It was more just that we were doing exploration in the region. So that shift of rhetoric is kind of what scared other countries into developing their weapons more. For example, Putin.
So your argument, okay, so now your argument changes. It's not that the Space Force actually develops offensive capabilities. It's just that Trump's rhetoric around the Space Force.
I mean, I think that they do, obviously. They are trying to. Our evidence says that they're trying to develop 48 new communications jammers, which are offensive weapons. But it's more that... What?
Yeah, you can go.
Okay, yeah, but it's more just that kind of shift of rhetoric and the creation of a new branch obviously indicates to other countries that we're gearing up to do something militaristic in space, and that's our argument.
So, okay, so for example, when the Air Force was in control of the space domain and they had the Air Force Space Command, they were also doing things like developing anti-satellite jammers and things like that. So what is actually different about the Space Force? Because they're doing the exact same thing.
No, because they're obviously developing more weapons. They weren't focusing on anti-satellite development when they were under Space Command.
Yeah, they were, because they're still part of the military. Like they were developing weapons. Like
yeah, but there was a definite increase in the amount of focus they had on these offensive operations under the Space Force, and that's our argument.
All right, that's fine. You can take the question.
Yeah, okay. So on your argument specifically about the South China Sea, if there are other actors, for example, there's like deterrence that exists on Earth for why China doesn't want to attack in the South China Sea. So if that were true, why would just deterrence in space be the one factor that would, trigger your impact?
Well, we wouldn't agree with the assertion that there's other checkbacks, especially because you don't give any examples of other actors. We said that the biggest actor is the US, and the way that the US intervenes is obviously militarily through like warships and things like that. And obviously they can't do that if their satellites are down, which is what our evidence indicates. Okay, so we would say that that's the biggest.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Let's see. So you say on your case that like miscalculation, or sorry, that our case is more unlikely because China does a first strike. So So do you know how China actually like invades other countries? Like they don't do a first strike. So
yeah, why would this but my argument is that any sort of military invasion that includes a lot more risk analysis is probably less likely than a scenario where, China thinks that they're being attacked by the US. They would act a lot quicker and they would 100% respond to that. Whereas you don't know if the risk analysis of China, I'd say there's a lot of reasons why they wouldn't want to launch a military attack because, there's a Taiwan-US alliance. There's a lot of things that stop them from doing that they're scared of. Whereas if you're responding to a country, that's probably a lot more likely.
Yeah, let's cross.
Okay, so I think that the end of the cross is the most interesting part to look at. So I think Nathan kind of made a little bit of a strategic error at the very end by allowing Sanjita to kind of explain her argument even more on the second contention about deterring adversaries, because he kind of just opened the door and was like, look, you want to explain the one response you have on our impact scenario? And then Sanjita gave like a pretty compelling response about this now, right? So now a lay judge is looking at this round and being like, oh yeah, actually there are a lot of other scenarios that could happen in terms of a war scenario. for instance, there are a lot of alliances that need to break down in order for this to happen. So I think that this is kind of like pushing the con team a little bit ahead after this crossfire, just because now like the lay judge can now understand exactly what Sanjita's kind of a little bit unwarranted response was after the rebuttal, because she was able to re-explain it during second cross, which I think is a strategic thing to do. Just maybe Nathan shouldn't have brought that up in the first place for her to do.
Yeah, I think this is a general theme throughout crossfires. And I think this is really helpful in front of lay judges, right? Because if you're thinking about it, a judge who's not, flowing every word of what you say, they're not going to have like a photographic memory of everything that happened in the speeches. So I think what Francesca says is really important, right? Like a lay judge in a lot of cases pays more attention to crossfire, right? So at this point, 2.5 minutes into crossfire, like a lay judge who hasn't been taking, very scrupulous notes probably doesn't even remember what Sanjita said on their argument about conflict and deterrence. But if you let Sanjita explain that well for 20 seconds at the end of crossfire, they will have a good idea of what that argument is. So that's kind of a general theme for crossfire. You don't want to really focus too much on what you think you can easily win, because if you think about it, Zara could have easily went up there in summary and said, look, they don't explain this argument very well. They don't tell you, why people are infighting, any of that. So I think it's really important that everyone, in their rounds, especially with lay audiences, you focus on your crossfires, you focus on exactly, what will work for you to win the round. And even if you have to take, 10 seconds of prep before that, it's definitely fine. Okay, so before the summary speech from Zara, I think I've just put the link to the prep giveaway in the description of the chat. So it's just one form for both the prep giveaway and the office hours. There's a question at the end of the form, which is just, do you want to also be entered for a chance to win free office hours? So yes, if yes, no, if no. So for all of you who are like, oh, I need a speech doc, it's a fast round. There you go. You can get all the prep in a couple of days, and things will be chilling. And then also, if you're also thinking about, summer programs, we also are offering 2 sessions that are open right now. And obviously signups are filling pretty quickly, just like they did last year. So make sure to sign up in the next couple of weeks, because we want to make sure that everyone, has an opportunity to attend the session that they want to attend. So if you're interested in the summer program, feel free to reach out, feel free to check out our website. We're definitely excited to have everyone who's already signed up and everyone who will sign up after today. So without further ado, now you all can get the prep in the next couple of days. And that's great. So we'll have Zara with the first summary from the pro, and we'll see if Zara makes the strategic discussions and the decisions that we talked about earlier.
Yes, just roadmap. I'm going to begin on their case, then weigh, then move on to our case. Is everyone good? Okay. They lose the round when they read you evidence saying that the Air Force, or that rather, there's no change between the Space Force and the Air Force. We agree there aren't any new offensive attacks. This takes out their first contention for the same reason that my partner gives you in rebuttal. Our Chang evidence says China and Russia and all these other countries, they're already militarizing. They're already in the space race. It's just a question of whether the US is going to join and catch up. They say that this ignores their evidence talking about an offensive shift, but it's post-dated by their own speech when they say that this is just a restructuring of programs already existing under the Air Force. Second, they say that these attacks are small in the past and therefore they're not that dangerous. But this just isn't true. Putting aside our impact about the South China Sea, even our own evidence in case, which they do not respond to, says an attack on a satellite can cause economic damage and uncertainty on par of that of a nuclear war. But let's talk specifically about their argument about a security dilemma. The same problem persists as we outlined in their second link. Namely, in either world, countries are going to have stuff to base their militaristic rhetoric on. They want to militarize. They're always going to find a justification to do it, whether the US is operating under the Air Force or the Space Force. These countries want to militarize. This is not what's getting in their way. Finally, let's get on to the weighing that goes ignored in their rebuttal. Second summary is a little late to address this by now. But what Nathan tells you very clearly is that if you want to vote on this notion of conflict, which you should because this is the only impact in sound, you should be voting for us. And that's because history is on our side. We aren't talking about a nuclear strike like they suggest. We are talking about Chinese territorial expansion in the South China Sea, which is often violent and risks the livelihoods of millions. Our chain card wins us the round. It goes uncontested, undisputed by both sides. Because China is projecting power, or is rather no longer able to use their satellites on the United States to project power because our Space Force is so strong, that means that they are no longer able to get away with expanding in this region without the United States pushing back on them. Their miscalculation argument has never occurred. Even though China and Russia have been militarizing for years and buying their analysis about the Space Force just being restructuring, the United States has been militarizing for years. And yet we haven't seen any indications of this miscalculation. You might perceive it as too large a threat, but you might also perceive it as too small a threat. This argument is very unclear. With that, on our case, you can group all of their responses talking about structuring and why this is a failure or the Space Force is just perceptual. This is not the case. Our evidence clearly states that prior to the Space Force, the United States was 6 to 8 years behind, and now we are in the lead. This is the cleanest piece of evidence. History is on our side if you are voting pro. With that, you are signing your ballot on our second contention because, as we say, if China is no longer able to project power in the South China Sea, then that means instability in that region decreases because they are no longer able to threaten American satellites to keep the United States out. They give you one response to this, and that's very late at the end of rebuttal, saying that other actors can stop this, but they do not give you any evidence or cannot name a single person to do this. And by the time they're at their second to last speech of the round, that's far too late to clarify the only attack they have left standing on our case. Thank you.
Awesome. So I think this speech kind of clarifies, what this debate kind of comes down to, right? It comes down to pro second contention versus a whole idea of the security dilemma. And I think that might be what a lot of debates come down to on this topic. And it's important for everyone to think about, how are we weighing deterrence versus aggression? Because in a lot of cases, you can't just say, we reread this like an impact that's much bigger about deterrence or much bigger about aggression. You really need to think about, why it is true that countries are deterred or why it is true that countries will become more aggressive. So that's where, evidence and analysis about, the history of what's happened with the Space Force, empirical evidence, that comes in really importantly in terms of how you can defend your link, whether that's aggression or that's deterrence. So I think Zara did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think Zara did a really good job on was the main response coming out like Sanjita's rebuttal was basically that it's created from like defensive to offensive operations. I think Zara did a really good job saying that it was just a restructuring of past Air Force programs, which I think makes a lot of like intuitive sense as well. I think one thing is like it could have been hit a little bit harder on because I feel like that's a very logical response that lay judges will want to pick up on. So going a little bit less responses and more hitting on one thing that really takes out their main response on their case can be super helpful in clarifying, especially in first summary. I do think that the extension of the weighing was also very good because this kind of was unresponded to. And it was also good that Zara did say like it's too late to respond in second summary or should be too late because kind of lay judges don't know when the responses should come up in the round. So pointing that out can be super helpful as well. I think all in all, it was like a really good speech. Sandeep, do you have any more comments on that?
Yeah, I think generally you want to make sure that you're kind of anticipating what the opponents are going to do. So since Zara and Nathan kind of know at this point, they're going to be talking about the conflict, then you all need to, on the AF, make sure that you have a clear narrative as to why the conflict scenario on the con is not going to happen. So also be ready to, deal with whatever the con's going to say, because the first final focus is difficult in front of lay judges. So it's really important to kind of build up a strong foundation as to why your link to deterrence or your argument about deterrence outweighs the con argument. So I think Zara did a good job really like forcing the weighing like clearly into the judge's mind. So that makes it easier for Nathan as well. So everyone knows that first speaking is much harder than second speaking, especially in lay rounds when the second speaking team can have the last word. So think about that when you're doing your first summary as well. Don't just leave everything up to the first final focus, because then the second final focus will probably have a little bit of an advantage.
I think one other thing going off of that maybe could have been improved about this speech, especially in terms of in front of lay judges, was the one main response that kind of happened, especially after crossfire, when Nathan asked the question like, "Oh, like, can you re-explain your like response on our impact?" Right. So Sanjita made a pretty compelling response by while there are alternative factors, are alternative actors as well, which means this won't actually like occur or whatever. And I think that Zara, the response in Zara's speech could have been a little bit more clear. Maybe I just didn't get it clearly enough about why there are alternative actors and why their impact is much more clear. And making sure just prioritizing some response on the main things that they say, because there weren't that many responses that had to be dealt with. But just I think that the clear response about like the restructuring of these like air forces just could have become a little more clear.
Yeah, I think generally another thing is you want to make sure that you can simplify the debate. So like I wouldn't be too opposed, especially like in a lay round, for Arjun to kind of go up in this next speech and say, this debate's between like about deterrence and aggression. Here's why the security dilemma is more likely, and then just read reasons about it. So remember, just simplify as much as you can, make it a very easy decision for the judge. So we'll see what happens with Arjun's next speech.
Okay. The thesis of the negative is that the Space Force is a failed political pawn that's provoking our adversaries. This happens through our first major argument about the security dilemma. The Space Force is an unprecedented move towards militarization in space that's scaring our adversaries and aggressing in space. Here, our opponents argue that the US and their adversaries were militarizing prior to the creation of the Space Force, and they just say that the Space Force created no additional benefit and tried to extend the overview onto our case. Two major problems here. One, they dropped the capaccio evidence from our case, which indicates that this is not a simple restructuring of the program. They're creating 48 new space jammers that are provoking China and Russia right now. But then two, the Straub, Cobb, and the Silva evidence all conclude the same thing, that this is a perceptual shift from defense to offense. So even if there isn't that much tangible difference, Russia and China are perceiving it as such, and thus they're aggressing further. If you don't know how to resolve this debate between aggression and deterrence, at least resolve it through the empirics. The BBC and New York Times evidence both go dropped in saying that both Russia and China are aggressing at newly high levels because they feel uniquely provoked due to the Space Force. At that point, that's a direct reason that we outweigh their case on probability. But then go to the impact. Our impact is a dire space miscalculation. Grego explains that space is uniquely poised for miscalculations because there's no track record to track enemies in space. This responds to their weighing because they say that we don't have any historical precedent for miscalculation. Yes, that's true. In space, there is no historical precedent, which is exactly why miscalculation is uniquely high, because we don't know how to track our adversaries. And Broder finds that that miscalculation would cause a frenzy on Earth, resulting in economies crumbling, food chains collapsing, and millions dying in a bitter battle between the three countries. The reason why we outweigh their case is twofold. First, I already explained the empirics prove that deterrence is failing and aggression is increasing right now. There's been a significant shift from the defensive to offensive posture. But second, on probability, their entire scenario is dependent on a conflict that is initiated by someone, but ours is an accidental retaliation, so it's much more likely. This is actually the argument that their own Dean evidence, which is from their impact, makes. The Dean evidence says that China is only focused on deterring conflict, meaning that they're not going to initiate anything. They'll only initiate a war or be involved in a war that started by accident, so our scenario is inherently much more probable. That, in addition to the weighing that goes dropped from Sanjita's rebuttal, which is talking about how there are so many alternate factors that are preventing China from escalating in the South China Sea and initiating a conflict. For example, in Cross, she mentioned how the US and Taiwan have a super strong alliance that is deterring China right now. With that, let's go to their case. The Barrow analysis said that the last time a new branch in the military was created, the Air Force, they spent the next 15 years competing with the Army, allowing the Soviets to get significantly ahead. All they say is that we're in the lead now, so it doesn't matter. But that's not indicative of what the evidence says. The evidence says that 15 years is more than enough time for Russia and China to get significantly ahead, and we're already seeing this happen, which is why I should prefer it, because the New York Times evidence and the BBC evidence both indicate that Russia and China are taking advantage of that inefficiency in the bureaucracy to go. The implication of this is that their deterrence won't ever happen because it'll take too long for us to create those deterrent effects. Ultimately, that's just more proof that the Space Force is inefficient and thus only provokes our adversaries. Thus negate.
Okay. I think Arjun did a really great job in the speech, especially in front of a lay judge. I think that the most effective part of the speech was his responses to the restructuring under the Air Force. It was super clear in explaining like the empirics on our side that China and Russia have actually seen it as posturing and have increased the amount of aggression they've done. And even though these like 48 new like whatever you're talking about, new missiles or satellites being deployed was still like an empiric on why it's actually increased aggression in the Space Force. I also think the weighing was super good, especially in terms of the empirics point again, because this just wasn't responded to by the pro team. I think that one thing that could have been improved though was you made the first step, Arjun did, about how it was about how like there are alternative factors about the US and Taiwan. I think that making it a little bit more clear in any round, lay, flay, or even in terms of a tech round, you want to explain why your impacts won't have alternative factors, right? So it can't just be explaining why the other team has alternative factors. It needs to be more specific about what they are, but also by why your impact's going to be the most clear, why it's the most probable, it's 100% going to come true, because then that just becomes a defensive response and doesn't actually work in terms of comparative weighing. So I think that's just one area where the weighing could have been improved upon. And also in terms of this weighing debate, again, I don't really hear a clear response to that the history was on their side, which is that like this like thing that Nathan and Zara keep on going off on in every single speech. So I think that maybe contrasting that with the empirics and being a little bit more clear about how that's comparatively how you're responding to it could be a good way to go in terms of the summary speech, especially in front of lay judges.
Yeah, and I think I agree with everything that's been said. I think it also might be important to point out that both speeches kind of did weighing in the middle of the speeches. After Arjun did, his offense first, then he talked about the weighing, and Zara did the defense first, and then kind of talked about the weighing. So I think it's also important that, you can put weighing at different places, in your speech. Some people think it's good to put it last in the middle. I'm personally of the belief that weighing in front of lay judges should happen first, like the first thing in your last, second half speeches. But obviously, that's, different for different people. I think one advantage of the weighing coming first is it kind of provides a roadmap of, where the judge should be making the decision, right? So if the first thing in the judge's head is, oh, this argument about, the conflict with China and Russia is most important, if they get that in their head, then the rest of your speech doesn't really matter because the judge will want to vote for you anyway. It's kind of like if someone was picking, which politician to vote for, and you're telling them, this issue is the most important thing you should be voting on, whether that's like climate change, gun policy, right? Then obviously one candidate or one side has already, expressed more of an interest in, that argument or that topic. So that's why I think weighing should be first in the summaries and final focus speeches, especially in front of lay judges. But I don't know if Franny has any differing thoughts there.
No, I agree with that. I guess one other thing that we can get into is like now we're getting into Grand Cross and kind of how to use it effectively, especially in front of lay judges. I think every like debater or most debaters kind of have this mindset of like, oh, Grand Cross should just be thrown away. And like it's like kind of like, oh, like end of the round kind of thing, right? Start like not paying attention. But especially in front of lay judges, Grand Cross can be the time when you can even like win the round, right? Because sometimes lay judges up until like the last second can be extremely confused. So you should use it as opportunities to explain arguments that you think might still be confusing, right? So in this case, right, there's some like arguments over the impact. Maybe you might want to get into the weighing debate, right? Because like Nathan and Zara might want to start talking about like why the empiric stuff that they're talking about doesn't make that much sense. Maybe Arjun and Sanjita want to get more into why actually being alternative factors means that they can't access their impact, right? So these type of things during Grand Cross can be super helpful to clear up because a lay judge could literally catch on to something that you said in Grand Cross. So make sure that you're like not just like slacking off during it or not paying attention, right? And really using this as a place to clarify your arguments and kind of explain responses that maybe weren't so clear in other parts of the round.
So I think we're ready to rumble for Grand.
Okay. Is everyone good? Okay. So your main frontline to your first contention talks about the idea of a perceptual threat. What exactly are China and Russia perceiving here?
They're perceiving a uniquely offensive posture where the US is militarizing in space.
A uniquely
Yes.
offensive posture, but we all agree that they're spending the same amount. It's just some
No, no, no.
bureaucracy changing around.
Yeah, so specifically, our argument is that the creation of a branch like the Space Force that is uniquely different or separate from prior space exploration stuff. You know, even if we were militarizing before, the militarization was occurring. Wait, can I just finish real quick? The militarization was occurring from branches that were, you know, primarily doing like space exploration and stuff. So when we shifted to a different branch completely that is now focusing on like developing weapons and anti-satellite stuff, and that's their sole purpose, other countries perceive that we are like preparing space for war. And that's what all three pieces of evidence indicate.
They were not, the branches of the military were absolutely not doing space exploration before that. That's NASA. We settled that in first cross. They were doing the same things that we're talking about. It's just
No,
that
they were putting up satellites and stuff.
Yeah, they were doing.
We're all talking about putting up satellites. If you would let me finish my response, this is really
Sure,
because we all agree, and like the evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of this. The reason why the Space Force is more powerful is just because it's more centralized. We were doing all of this stuff before. It's just a question of it being more efficient. But you can have
No, we weren't though.
Okay,
All we
well,
were doing was we had military spending before in space, but that was to defend ourselves against potential military provocations from the other side. Now we're using that spending to do like put up more satellites, put up more rockets, which is why the Capaccio evidence says that we're creating 48 new jammers to jam Chinese and Russian satellites. Like that's a direct example.
But Arjun, your evidence just says that the Space Force is creating more anti-satellite systems. That doesn't say that the Space Force is creating that now. That doesn't say that the Air Force wasn't creating that prior to that. You have no evidence suggesting that. Like in 2015,
sure.
2017, the Air Force created anti-satellite weapon systems, and we could read your evidence on that.
Sure, okay, that's fine, but that's still not accounting for the fact that Russia and China are both taking this as uniquely like militarized approach, and that's why they've acted on it too. And Russia and China both have increased the amount of militarization in space as well.
Also responded to that in prior speeches that other countries like Russia and China were always going to use the U.S. as a scapegoat, regardless of how they're spending.
No, that's not what you said, right? You said that Russia and China are going to use it as scapegoat, and I frontlined that and said that, yeah, because we are creating more weapons and we're creating this perception of militarization, if anything, that supercharges our argument that we're now giving them even more of a scapegoat to create more weapons, and that's what Putin has been able to do, because our evidence from Putin is after the creation of the Space Force and how he was able to do that and use that as like a perceptual shift.
Yeah.
But regardless, let's talk about your case really quickly. On your contention too, does your evidence isolate for the fact, the reasoning for why the US is ahead now being the Space Force?
Yeah, and also we make warrants as to why.
Chang 20. So within 3 months of Chang being published and the Space Force being created, the Space Force just was the sole reason why we're ahead now.
No, it wasn't 3 months. Also, like you can do a lot in 3 months. Like the Space Force did a lot in a year.
It was created in December of 2019, but that's not the point. Like, how did it do it that fast then?
Like they just innovated in new weapons, but that's fine.
3 months.
Okay, yeah, so Grand Cross, obviously, you know, as Franny mentioned, it's kind of difficult to, you know, get a lot done in Grand Cross, but there are certain things that you can get done. So I think at the end there, what you saw is the con was trying to really kind of poke a final hole in the AF argument about deterrence, kind of saying like what did the Space Force actually do, right? And these are the kind of questions that you can ask in Grand Cross, right? You don't necessarily, especially in front of a more traditional judge, you don't necessarily have to, you know, sit back and say, oh, like, let me ask about this specific response you read here. You can poke little holes in arguments from here and there. So I encourage everyone to do that, right? If you think you're behind on a certain argument in a certain place on the flow in Grand Crossfire, ask clarifying questions and ask questions that can feed into analytical responses. Because a lot of the time what you can see is if you prod a lot in Grand Crossfire and there's a lot of issues whether the other team's really not answering your question, then you can go up in the final focus, especially in front of a more traditional judge, and say, look, we asked them in Grand Crossfire and they couldn't explain these 3 things, A, B, C. And if you list that out, that's kind of just like 3 responses that you can just kind of pull out of Grand Cross just like that. And obviously there's no evidence in them. They're just, you know, analytical responses. Obviously they're a little new, right? Coming in the final focus, but a lot of judges, especially traditional judges, will appreciate that, right? That you're making new analysis in grand crossfire that's really cutting to the core of arguments, and they won't be like a very, like a stickler on, oh, I didn't hear this in summary. And like I've had rounds myself where, grand cross was actually pivotal, like the ability to make some analytical responses, especially in front of traditional audiences, was really important. So I think everyone should definitely refocus on that this month, where, maybe in past months at national tournaments, you kind of didn't really care about grand cross, kind of make it more of a priority, especially online when a lot of people are interrupting each other. When you come out kind of as a voice of reason with good explanations, it always looks good for traditional judges.
I think kind of getting into now strategies for final focus. Like we talked about, it's really been brought down to, has the Space Force deterred adversaries or actually made them more aggressive? So I think coming into this, Nathan can really go off of like kind of the weighing that they've been doing that wasn't really responded to in past speeches. That was like, historically, we have seen that it is stopped, that it has actually deterred our adversaries, and kind of going off the weighing that was unresponded to, I think could be something that's really strategic going into the final focuses, and focusing on that, because that's something that in any judge's mind that hasn't been responded to, especially in front of a lay judge, that's like a very logical thing that they're talking about, and something that really is understandable. There aren't also many responses to the argument in general. So spending more time on just explaining your argument and why it outweighs the other side's arguments, because if you win the weighing debate, you basically just win your argument, and there's not many responses to it, and it's kind of more messy on the con side, could also be another strategy that Nathan goes for going into his pro final focus.
Yeah, and before we jump in, just based on all the activity in the chat, if y'all are, thinking about signing up and you have a bunch of friends that you want to sign up with you, we are offering a group discount of 10% for groups of 6 or more. So if everyone in the chat, is excited about PFA, if anyone's feeling good, if you want to come with your teammates, we definitely encourage that because PFA is always a good time. People are having fun. And so we want to make sure as many groups of people can come as you want. So that's something to think about as well. So going into Nathan's final focus, like there's really one question that you should be thinking about. And it's the same thing for Sanjita's final focus. And for any kind of got to this, is deterrence or aggression the main like driving force behind what's happening with the Space Force, right? If Nathan confidently proves it's deterrence, then the pro team should win the round. If Sanjita confidently proves that it's aggression, then the con team will win the round. So deterrence pro, let's see if Nathan can seal the deal. And then we'll see if Sanjita can, seal the deal in the other direction after.
All right. Is everyone ready? Great, awesome. My opponents can read you all the evidence they like, but at the end of the day, let's look to actual history. They agree from the Cheng evidence, which finds that other countries like China and Russia were already militarizing space regardless of the Space Force, which means that their arguments happen regardless of who you vote for. Let's go to why this is true. On the top of their case, they try to tell you that the Space Force is creating 48 new jammers. That's fine. The US developing a few more jammers, which we already had to begin with, is going to cause World War III. At the end of the day, our argument is that regardless of whether the Space Force militarizes, other countries still will, which means the chance of conflict always exists in either world. They then say that there's a perceptual shift from offense to defense, or defense to offense rather, and new response in the second summary. They give still no warrant why it's a perceptual shift. The US military always focused on space, so why would there be a shift? Overall, the chance of miscalculation exists in either world because they concede, once again, that Russia and China were already militarizing far before the Space Force. That's the only historical empiric in today's round. They try to tell you that China and Russia are aggressing at highly new levels. I just responded to this just now. They were already doing it regardless. Let's go into the weighing debate, where are you voting for us? They first say on their weighing that aggression is increasing right now. Again, I already responded to this. You just cross-apply what I said before. But secondly, they say that miscalculation is more likely and that China has never done, that China has only focused on deterring conflicts. No, they literally invaded Vietnam and Taiwan in the past, which is definitely a first strike. They say there's alternative actors to stop China. No examples, once again, no warranting, no explanation. Don't vote on this. Feel very uncomfortable if you do. We say the biggest thing deterring China is the US, which has historically been the case. At the end of the day, you look to our weighing first on historical precedents and probability that yes, they can talk about all they want about a nuclear strike, but the only thing that's realistically happened in the past has been China invading areas in the South China Sea. They say war is more likely in space, but they just say, believe our impact is true, it's probably going to happen. But at the end of the day, you have no idea what will actually happen. Remember that they have no evidence saying how likely miscalculation is. They're just twisting what their evidence actually says. Remember, this weighing is more important than my opponents, because if their impact does not happen due to low probability, it does not matter how big of an impact it is. They try to say on our case, this whole thing about how the Air Force is really behind, but this is about the Air Force. Our evidence indicates that specific to the Space Force, that we are now ahead over our adversaries when before we weren't, because of consolidating power in the Space Force. Thank you, and vote AF.
Okay, I think Nathan did a really great job here, especially in front of lay judges, laying out kind of what Cindy was talking about before. This debate comes down to deterrence versus aggression. And Nathan really hit it home with this weighing debate by just being like, history's on our side. It doesn't matter how many scenarios they can pull up, because militarization would have happened no matter what. And we can see clearly that they will invade, and China will do stuff in the South China Sea and do territorial expansion, which has happened before. I think one thing that could be taken away from this speech is as a bit of a negative and maybe something to work on is, especially in front of lay judges, to stay away from buzzwords. So making sure that when you say things, especially in terms of weighing, like the one instance of being like, I've already responded to this, right? Say the response one more time, because especially in front of lay judges, they want to know how everything applies and how everything's going to play out in terms of this argument. Also just saying things like probability means that they can't access their argument. Explain that, like exactly what that means, right? So since that this has never happened in the past, it's never going to happen, no matter how big their impact is, they're never going to access it because of X reason, right? So I think that explaining these things a little bit more and staying away from buzzwords can be especially helpful, especially because it's the last speech and the last thing that they're going to hear. And you want to make sure that a lay judge will have the least amount of confusion possible and really just understand your argument as much as possible. But I think that Nathan did a great job here in terms of the weighing debate.
I think the only thing I can really add on to that is in every round, each speech has a tendency to get progressively faster and faster just because, you know, more stuff is being covered and you kind of have less time to say, to talk about what you want. So I think obviously this final focus was definitely a little faster than the rest of the speeches in the round. But obviously, you know, there's a lot to cover and now there's only 2 minutes. So I think everyone should kind of be wary of that going into the final focus, is that you don't want to, you know, necessarily speed up, because I've seen a lot of lay and traditional rounds, you know, at my own state tournament and like national qualifiers that basically come down to whichever team spoke slower in their final focus speech. So you can definitely, you know, maybe take out a couple of responses or a couple pieces of analysis and kind of really focus in on the bigger picture of deterrence versus aggression on this topic. So I think that's something that's super important. And you all should think about that, especially in the online setting where, you know, the more slow you go, it's kind of amplified by, you know, the online and the difficulties of communicating through online, which is what debate is right now. So the more you can kind of control your pace, control the kind of the rhythm of your speech, then you'll be good to go. So I think that that's something to think about. We'll see if Sanjita is a little slower than Nathan, maybe a little faster. Who knows what'll happen? But that's just like a very, very basic thing everyone can do to pick up more ballots and be more successful at the local level.
Okay. Remember at the end of the day that even if you buy their arguments that militarization was occurring before the Space Force, they never effectively respond to the fact that that militarization was not enough to trigger large-scale attacks from other countries. The only response that Nathan extends to our case in his last speech is that this militarization was occurring. However, we tell you that all of the attacks and that sort of stuff that was occurring were very low-level attacks. For example, in their case itself, he gives examples of China attacking the United States. You see that there was no actual impact of these attacks in the first place because they were all very low level. However, our evidence isolates after the creation of the Space Force, both Putin from Russia and China directly creating more space weapons as a result of the creation of the Space Force. Our COB evidence and the BBC evidence never get responded to. At that point, the only other response he has on our case is about how we don't contextualize our impact about miscalculation. But they never respond to the Grego evidence, which says that space is a very unique environment for miscalculation cooperation because we don't have any precedents or rules set in the area since there's never been any conflict break out. At that point, our Miller evidence gives you two ways in which countries like Russia and China would respond. One, they would increase their missile production in the first place, and second, they would increase the number of warheads on each missile. This makes the perception of an accidental attack much, much more likely. At that point, the only piece of weighing left in the round is how they've invaded Taiwan before and there's historical precedents for their arguments. However, the invasions they talk about happened decades ago. They don't effectively respond to Arjun's response from Dean, which tells you that right now, China is uniquely focusing only on deterrence, which means that they have no incentive to launch an attack or a military invasion on another country. Our impact is always more probable than theirs because it's reliant on an accidental attack rather than an actual intentional attack, which no country wants to do. But then on their case, they make the crucial response of never responding to the infighting response, which tells you there's a lot of inefficiencies in the first 10 to 15 years of the creation of a new military branch. All he says is that it's the Air Force and not the Space Force. It's a historical example of when you split up two military branches into a separate one, you create inefficiencies and tensions between the branches, which means productivity does not occur for 10 to 15 years. In that time frame, our impact's already triggered, so ours always comes first.
Yeah, so I think generally, again, it's all back to the same idea, right? Is deterrence or aggression the main way forward? And so I think what both teams really did well in this round is kind of thought about how everything fits together, right? So is deterrence something that's unique at the top level about, what's happening right now, the word like uniqueness, or is it something that's different at the impact level? And I think this round kind of proved very systematically that you need to know what the difference is between deterrence throughout the whole part of the argument and aggression between the whole part of the argument. So for example, with the deterrence, you're saying that what's happening right now or before the Space Force was a lot of aggression, a lot of militarization by other countries. If you're the con and you want to talk about aggression, you're saying, no, it was a nice peaceful area and there was no major conflict. And then on the impact, the pro, you're saying that, countries are conflict oriented. China and Russia want to go to conflict, so we need to deter them. Whereas on the con, you're saying the opposite. You're saying, no one really wants conflict, but the more we egg each other on, the more we miscalculate, the more likely a conflict is. So everyone needs to understand those differences and how they play out in the round.
Yeah, just going off of that, I think Sanjita did a really good job, especially clearing up the weighing debate. And again, just like Sandeep was talking about, both teams from the get-go had a very clear idea of what they wanted to go for. They didn't go for too many arguments. They really collapsed early and made crossfire so the entire round about this thing about deterrence versus aggression, and just made it easy for the judge or whoever it is, right, to clearly understand that what this boils down to is just, do they believe in aggression or deterrence? And that's where they're going to assign their ballot. And there was very ballot directive language, especially in Sanjita's final focus, which I think is a really good thing to think of, especially in front of lay judges, and explain to them where they should vote, how they should vote, and how they should be looking at the flow.
Yeah, so I think generally a few big takeaways. Obviously, we don't want to keep anyone here for much longer. We're happy that most everyone stayed. Big things to think about on this topic is it's really boiling down to deterrence on the AF versus aggression on the con. There's arguments on both sides about scientific exploration and the economic benefits of space, but in a lot of cases, those can also be boiled down to arguments about deterrence or aggression. As we saw in this round where the con, they initially talked about cooperation, things like the ISS, but the whole idea behind that argument is that countries will get mad when the US is militarizing. So you can go in many different directions, but the core of like the military part of this debate, knowing that the Space Force is a sixth branch of the military, is deterrence versus aggression. So make sure you have a good handle on that. Another thing that I would definitely think about is knowing, what's happening right now. This is what's like known as the uniqueness. Basically know what scenarios are happening. Are other countries militarizing? Have they been militarizing? And that will kind of shape your arguments, right? As I explained, you want pre-Space Force to be kind of space as a theater of conflict, and con, you kind of want it to be peaceful. So definitely explore other arguments that don't necessarily have to do with conflict, whether they have to do with satellites or the economic benefits. And the last thing that I would say, this is like not an important, but I think it's an interesting point to think about. I think the con side did a good job of explaining some historical precedents with the Air Force, maybe that there was infighting or maybe the Air Force did something when they were newly established. That's a great place for you all to research because there's not a lot of evidence about, the creation of the Marine or like the Navy or the Army, but there is a lot of evidence that talks about what happened after we created the Air Force in the aftermath of World War II, right? And kind of what was going on, what was the Air Force's role in the Cold War, and why was that bad? Why was that good? So think about that, and you can definitely do a lot of research there. I guess that's kind of like a unique research tip, which is very exciting. So I guess all in all, thank you everyone for coming out. It's been a good hour and a half. The chat was going crazy at some points, but overall it was a good time, and we hope you got a lot out of this. So I know there's questions about when's the prep being sent. We're hoping to send it as early as we can tomorrow, just so we can consolidate all the evidence, make sure it's easy to read, make sure it's accessible. And we will pick 4 people who filled out the form to get free office hours with PFA instructors, and we'll get in contact with them about that. The last thing I'll say is all of us are really excited to see who's going to come work with us this summer. We're really excited. We're putting together a good curriculum. And if you thought this round, gave you some good tips on lay debate, we have a lot more at camp. So feel free to reach out, email Public Forum Academy if you have any questions about the round, questions about the instructors. We're happy to answer. But other than that, I think everyone's set to go. It's been a good time, and we're happy that everyone showed up, and we're hoping to see you this summer, see you at local tournaments, and we hope everyone here has great success in their March tournaments and tournaments down the line. So thank you all for coming. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.